Welcome to Collegial Conversations with Diana Clark, the professional webinar series that offers clinical and personal perspectives on issues that are common, but often not talked about. Here is today's Collegial Conversation.
Thank you for joining a Collegial Conversation with Diana Clark. Today, joining Diana is Dr. Jerry Finkelstein. Dr. Finkelstein is a clinical psychologist and served as the director of the New School Colleges Counseling Center in New York City for 15 years and is the author of Where Are Your Knots? Getting Unstuck with Your Life. Diana and Jerry will be discussing what it means to have unexamined emotional and psychological knots and ways you can lead a more fulfilling and purposeful life. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Finkelstein. I'm going to pass the conversation over to Diana now.
Thank you, Sydney. And welcome, Dr. Finkelstein. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today.
Thanks.
So for our listeners who can't see the book, it is the K in knots is in parentheses. So the implication being, where are your blocks? Where are you saying no, right? Is that?
Yeah. I mean, I sort of, trying to be a little clever, I guess.
It's clever.
I think that the idea of the book is sort of like the experiences you have in your life, and the inability to resolve those experiences leads to things that happen in your life that are either destructive or ways in which you can engage in the world that are productive and creative. So the knots with a K create knots, N-O-T-S, whereby you suddenly find yourself limited because of that.
So the workarounds, I'm going to go a little deeper. So Let's imagine that somebody has a trauma, even a small T trauma or an attachment issue or something that occurs very, very young, and they develop behavior as a workaround. Is that what you're talking about when you say knots?
Yes. So I think one of the ways that in the introduction that I think I try to make an analogy between, because I think it's helpful for people sometimes to concretize it. So between sort of like a physical injury. So for instance, if you break your shoulder, right, and then when it heals, you have a lot of scar tissue, right, and then you try to use your shoulder, your arm, you have limited use of it because it's all knotted up. So you have to sort of one, identify that that's the problem, and two, then be able to do the work to kind of release some of that scar tissue, emotional scar tissue, so that you can feel like you have more mobility, more flexibility in your life.
I like that. That also speaks to even that analogy, and I'm queen for taking an analogy too far, so let me know. In that analogy, what would also happen is that the other shoulder, let's say it was a shoulder injury, right? You would use your other shoulder, you would use other strategies to access as compensation. Is that also what you would see?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's great to extend. I think that's a good way to extend the analogy. I think basically a lot. What happens a lot is compensatory. So basically, if you're limited in a particular way, you find other ways to manage that. To manage the experience. Even from a structural standpoint, physically, like if you have a certain rigidity in a way, you may counterbalance your body, even literally by suddenly you don't even realize that your neck is tilted, to hold on to it. So if you expand that to, people's emotional lives, you could see that some of the things that people choose to do, they're just ways of trying to deal with what they are not the fundamental problem that they're not addressing. It's kind of like not going to physical therapy all those years and wondering why you can't move your arm. It's this, and then why your back hurts, or why your neck hurts, or why this hurt. And so it's a similar kind of thing where if you're knotted up, the stuff that you're not able to really process, because maybe you're just not capable of it, even when you're little, that gets stored. And then, there's a lot of fear and anxiety related to those experiences. And then you need to, because you're not aware of it, you're doing things all the time that are compensating for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, stretching that analogy.
Yeah.
When somebody starts accessing or looking at those knots or
Right.
using that shoulder again, what do they experience?
I think they experience, certainly in the beginning, like, well, there's a couple of things. Hopefully there's like an aha moment where they go like, oh, I get it. So I'm doing all of these things because I don't want to feel this. And then probably some panic sets in a little bit, because this like, oh no, now that I have to actually like really look at this. And it can be like one of my favorite words, discombobulating, because you're used to doing things, even if they're destructive, the same way. And it's that. So and now you're questioning it. So suddenly things begin to shift, and you are confronted with the idea that if you keep doing X, Y, and Z, where that leads, and suddenly you're going to have to start doing a deeper dive to figure out like how, like the title of the introduction, right? Which I always think of every time I work with anybody, and I hope I would like them to think of it as well, which is how the hell did I get, where the hell am I, and how the hell did I get here? I think it's the fundamental therapy question. The therapist asks it, and the patient should ask it as well, right? Because they show up, they're all, whatever their knots are, whatever their experiences are, have led them to this point, and they can't get out of their own way, right? So you're working together to try to expand how they see their life.
Yes. Yes. So can you give me a case study or an example of somebody you worked with that would have had a knot and the way you were able to work through that?
Yeah, that's a great. See, I'm trying to many people I've worked with. I think this is a really great example. This is a young man I've worked with for a number of years who lived his whole life with one distraction after the next. I mean, everything from excessive video games to continually like seeking out these very superficial relationships and getting drunk a lot and all of this stuff, and not being able to kind of be in the world in any kind of real way, kept escaping. He had the advantage of having some money, so he was able to actually continue doing this without there being any like real life consequences, like I have to pay my bills kind of thing. I just put that, but basically what it became very clear is that and this is sort of one of the things addressed in the book, is that what he was, there was this underlying terror that he had about dealing, understanding kind of the pain that he experienced when he was growing up, and that basically the rejection that he felt, and that basically, he sort of grew up with what I call a narcissistic parent who kind of really sort of ignored his emotional experiences, and when he didn't respond the way that he was expected to, he was dismissed, or there was anger directed towards. So he grew up frightened and afraid to be really present in the world, because that meant, what happens if I mess up, if I don't do the right thing? So he spent a lot of his life just trying to just run away from all of that. And then we were slowly, it took a while, able to really pinpoint, kind of get to that dynamic for him. And once he started to really see it, it just opened up a floodgate. I mean, it was kind of remarkable. And it was very, as I use the word in the book, it wasn't like, and I never, would would ever want to claim that any of this stuff is easy, that you just snap your fingers and it works. But if you make the commitment and you understand the process, he went from being completely living a kind of reactive false life to feeling much more liberated and authentic. Like, he still has things he has to accomplish, but he feels like he's in the world now, that he actually can actually do this, and he's not like haunted by all of these things. So his actions, he's not really engaging in as many NOTSs.
Right. How do you think the framework is helpful to somebody who is new to a therapeutic process?
Right. Well, let me just say that, I think that the reason I wrote the book, right, was specifically, I've been doing this a long time, and I kind of look at the book as sort of my they call it like capstone projects in college. I was thinking like, all right, well, what is it that I want to write about? Because I do a lot of writing, and not often, I don't actually write that much in this field. I've done a lot of creative stuff, and I really wanted to do something that I felt was meaningful, that was accessible, that really people could pick up, like literally in an hour and a half, and read it, and then feel like, oh, I never thought about that. I never, what I'm trying to do is expand people's lenses, right? Make them, we all get very myopic, right? And we sort of keep doing the same things, as sort of give people a framework to go like, whoa, let me just pull back the camera here and wide angle lens it and see like, where is all this coming from? Like, what is driving all of this stuff? Whether it's lack of success, dropping out of school, drinking, whatever it is, having terrible relationships with people, just failed relationships. It's like, well, how do you create a narrative, right? And a way of being curious about that gives context, so that you can understand, have a beginning of an understanding of why you're in the mess that you're in.
Does anybody not have knots, Dr. Finkelstein?
Probably not.
Have you met any? Right.
Well, not the
come to us when they do.
Well, I think that the bottom line is that obviously we're all flawed, and all, there is so much that can happen. Like, as I break the book up, it's like one of them is called like, it's shit happens, basically. So you could have the most perfect upbringing, whatever that means, like a really nurturing, caring, loving family. And something, traumatic happens to you when you're at school, or when you're, things happen all the time. I think the premise of of this book is saying that, I think that when the knots occur earlier, right, I think it sort of like narrows your bandwidth to deal with future knots. So like the more flexibility, the healthier you are, let's say, going into adulthood, something traumatic happens. It doesn't mean it's not traumatic. It doesn't mean that it doesn't take time to recover from, but you have a greater capacity to do that because you haven't been so knotted up before. You have more resources to use to heal yourself. When you have knots, a series of knots that occur when you're younger, right, you're already starting with less equipment to really be able to solve the problems that you have to face, that we all face as adults: illnesses, death, all kind of assaults, whatever we all as humans face. So it's really more a matter of having, I like to use the word bandwidth, like a greatest capacity to feel like you can find creative solutions and meaningful solutions and not get so bogged down.
Right. So many of the people who watch the show are parents of young adults.
Mm-hmm.
And their experience of young adulthood right now is pretty stressful. What they're seeing. What are you seeing and hearing from our young adult population?
Yeah, well, I would say it's my first reaction is it's very hard to be a young adult in this world, and I think that it raises really, unusual challenges for parents as well. But I mean, not to mention the fact that we just went through a pandemic for 2.5 years. The political culture of our world, climate change. I mean, these are things that are extreme. We're not even talking about anything internal at this point. We're just talking about how do you navigate all of that? And, financial insecurity. It's really daunting to be a 20-year-old and to figure out like how you're going to navigate something with hope and feel good about the world, right? I mean, it's a challenge. And so I feel like it's important for parents to understand that the position that they're being placed in with their kids is a particularly different one, because they don't have any answers to any of those questions. It's not like they can intervene and go like, okay, yeah, do this. This is like the world, right? And you have people, let's say they were 16, 17 years old in 2020, who have had to watch 1 million people, or hear about 1 million people die, who probably know people who have died, right? I mean, everybody has been touched by this. And then, so it's that, talk about trauma, right? To sort of like cultural, we have cultural trauma because we have the kind of, this sort of, partisanship and crazy stuff that's going on, right? Like the end of democracy, like a small thing like that, right? And then you have a pandemic that wipes out millions of people. And like, how does a 20-year-old process that? I mean, I think it's a good question. I don't really have any magic answers for that, but I think parents, I guess on sort of thinking of it that way, it kind of maybe helps a parent recognize like, wow, my kid is truly being challenged in ways that I couldn't even imagine, because there's no certainty.
Right. Do you think that the expectations of parents, kids graduating from college at 21 and navigating the world like they used to in the 70s, you graduated and you were launched. Is that a realistic goal at this point?
I think it's a much bigger challenge. I honestly do. And I think that it's probably important. I think one of the stresses for parents that they get into is like sort of have this like timetable. Okay, you're 18 to 22 and you're finished, right? And it's not that simple. I mean, it's never been that simple, but it's really not that simple now. And I think that the best thing parents can do is, create reasonable boundaries and expectations so that, but also understand that it's not a straight line for a lot of people, and less so now, and that people need some wiggle room, their kids need some wiggle room. And the thing that's going to, I mean, it's not like let's let them run wild, but it's more really appreciating and listening to the concerns that they have, and not simply just imposing like, this is what you need to do because you're 19. I think that's a big mistake. That will cause tremendous amount of upheaval in your family life to do that. So you have to find this balance between holding, having some reasonable expectations. Like if you're not going to go to college, okay, what are you going to do? Okay, you're going to work. Great. Okay, do that. That's good. But just sort of supporting growth, but understanding that growth doesn't have in these days, it needs to be looked at in a different way.
Yeah. One more question for those parents out there, for those who I hope will pick up the book and read it. What would you say to them who know that some of what their parenting did was create a knot? What are the ways they can support this process for their loved one to address it?
Mm-hmm. I think, well, there's a number of different levels of that. I mean, obviously, if a parent really feels like their child is struggling, obviously finding ways for them to get help is essential. And if there are stigmas about that, trying to work through your own stigma as a parent so that you don't get in the way of your child getting the kind of help that they might need. And the second part is if you really are able to, as a parent, and this is very hard for a lot of parents, right? They're like, to really face like, oh my God, I really did do this, right? And so, and this, I can see why this has an impact, is to have honest conversations and to take the risk of sharing, being human with your kids and basically saying, I think that in these circumstances, I didn't handle that right. And I could see how that had an impact here. I think that that's such a relief for kids that they don't imagine that their parent would ever say that to them, because we're all so busy defending our positions and our honor and don't want to be vulnerable with our own kids. And I think that that's a gift. And then gives permission for dialogue about that, which can open up knots, because a lot of times those things can create real schisms between parents and kids, and there's no communication. They move away, and suddenly you bring up something, blah, blah, whatever it is, that then is like, oh, we can actually talk about this now. Oh my goodness. And that could be, not only is it great for the child-parent relationship, it also fosters the child's growth and the parent's growth too, as a person.
Well, that's an optimistic note. Is there anything you have learned in your years of practice that you would like to leave us with today? Broad question.
Yeah, I guess simply, I go back to the book for this reason. I think being curious about your life, trying to sort of create a narrative of your experience, trying to seek out kind of ways in which you can learn more, whether it's conversations with your parent, to sort of enrich yourself in terms of, and also to expand your capacity to feel your life, be in your life. And part of that means you have to become comfortable with your emotional world and get to the knots sometimes, because those emotions are stuck in there. And that makes you a more vibrant, resilient person and allows you to engage in your life, I think, in a more creative, fully way.
Yay. I love that. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We've been talking with Dr. Jerry Finkelstein, who wrote the book, Where's Your Knots?
Thank you.
Thank you for joining this webinar. Tune in to more webinars and sign up for our newsletter at o'connorpg.com.